Then
You got it.
right, David, over to you.
All right, fellas. Well, thanks for showing up. Super excited about Knight, and he's going to give us a presentation. He had a couple different things to talk about, but he'll introduce himself. But Naval Academy grad, just crushing it as an entrepreneur. Really focused on health, wellness, leadership, being outside. And for those of you who don't know what Cairn Leadership is, he'll explain some of that. But it's really what excited us. He's been on the podcast a few episodes ago. Really excited us about having him on is just this. It really resonated, the idea of creativity and flow and being outside and how to achieve your highest and best and really get out of this environment that I think where a lot of us are being lied to, the most collaborative environments, getting on Teams and online and through the social medias and all these things to be, to achieve our most creative and best business selves. And that's just extremely false. And we feel it when we're outside, we know it. And there's data to support it. And Knight has a ton of that data. He's built a business around it and just super excited for this talk. So we're going to get into it in our Kinetic Life series and talk about flow.
You have to say it like that too, I think.
Yeah, every time.
See if I can get you all on the same screen. Awesome. How's everybody doing today?
Good, man.
Give double
Looks
chakras, thumbs up, whatever. Small groups so we can be a little more interactive. Everybody can see my screen here, hopefully.
Yes, sir.
There's nothing I hate more than Zoom meetings and PowerPoint. So here we are. I'm glad to be here with you talking about at least a subject that I love, flow. This is kind of a presentation, but I'm going to try to break it up and make it a little more conversational with you all since we got such a small group. So I'm curious if has anyone read books about flow, studied it, made it part of their lives already? Where are we on the only flow I know about is like when I have to call a plumber to, I study it extensively. Got some thumbs up.
Never studied it.
I think I'm more on the plumber side.
Nice. It's pretty fascinating. So I'd like to start out with a story here. I was in Joshua Tree. Anyone ever climbed in Joshua Tree or been there? Pretty sweet place. Terrifying climbing. Like 5.5 is supposed to be really easy. I get on the climb. I'm sweating. I'm shaking. I've got all this rock climbing gear clipped to my harness and it's all metal. So I can't hide that I'm terrified at this point because I'm shaking so much like that. And all my gear is jingling and everybody's like, oh, what's going on up there? And I'm like, no, nothing. And I, at this point, was studying flow kind of for the first time purposefully because I had found this concept and I thought it might be important for our company. And so some of the things we're going to talk about later, there's a cycle to flow. And I realized as I was sitting there sweating, trying not to cry, jingling all over the rock, that I was maybe in this struggle phase. And if I just thought about releasing and boom, just like that, I released into flow and I could feel it. And I started climbing, focused on the climb, not thinking about fear, not feeling fear, kind of some of the hallmarks of flow. And it's this really cool experience for me because up until that point, it was kind of like this accidental thing. You can sort of get into flow accidentally. It's a really cool feeling, maybe mountain bike more, maybe rock climb more. But it wasn't maybe we can manipulate and use this thing type idea. So just quickly about me, I went to the Naval Academy, got to fly helicopters, lead sailors for 16 years. Then I got out partly due to a coaching conversation with a coach who said, well, why don't you just teach leadership outdoors? So I started working for a national outdoor leadership school, started working for REI, started getting certified by American Mountain Guide Association and taking leaders outside where David mentioned. It's just this wonderful place to both experience and practice leading. So my passion really personally is getting people outside, making people understand that the outdoors isn't a place for troubled youth and college kids trying to find themselves. It's where executives ought to be. It's where high-performing teams need to be. It's where we learn a lot faster and can actually practice the things that we're learning. Some of the outcomes today is just to go through a history of flow. It's a pretty fascinating idea. And really, it's this idea of happiness and maximum performance, which most of us are probably interested in. Think about what it's about and then talk about what's happening. We've got a lot of new research that shows what's happening in our bodies when we're in flow, which gives us more access to creating lives that lead to more flow in the long run. So we'll talk a lot about how we get more. Please feel free to interrupt, throw things in the chat. Maybe David and Stu, if you see things in the chat, questions, just shout them out. I'd love to make this more conversational as we go. I'm going to start with one of the first times I remember being in flow. I'm sure I was in flow many times before that, but as most of you probably were, I was so into car audio when I was in high school. Like, it was the coolest thing. And one of my friends called up. Back then, we didn't have cell phones. We had like landlines. He called the landline. He's like, Knight, I just got two 15-inch JL subwoofers. I need help putting them in my car. And I was like, I'll be there 20 minutes. So I drive over. It's like 10 a.m. and we get into it. We're figuring out how to route the power through the amps, all the good stuff. And maybe 5 minutes later, his parents come into the barn where we're working. They're like, hey, Knight, your parents are calling. Like, are you going home for dinner? And I realized that whole day had just like snapped by. I had completely lost track of time. I was completely into this process, engaged in putting in these subwoofers. So I'm curious from you all, like, does anyone have maybe 2 or 3 people share that kind of experience? Most of us have had a couple of those. Maybe we have them more and maybe less, but who's had an experience like that where you just lost track of time? You could,
Yeah,
like,
yesterday was I went for a mountain bike ride and got home a little after my wife was happy about, but I was like, man, I was just completely lost in it. It was awesome until I got home.
Yeah, you gotta pay the piper when you get home. Anyone else?
Similar, like I find myself, and some of these guys will make fun of me because I've said it before, like just going for long runs. Like I enjoy running outdoors in nature, in the mountains, and I will completely lose myself and lose track of time. Especially if I'm like, listening to something positive or listening to some good music, and I'm just like fired up and like, pumping my fists and running, and I get really into it.
Nice. The idea of being
That sounds gross.
I found that I'm not able to run like Stu, but walking, I do long walks every day. And I found that that's where I get into this state where I'll do a lot of notes to myself. Like I'll talk out loud about what's going on. I'll make phone calls, and I just find this like new sense of energy and creativity after a certain amount of time.
Nice. Yeah. So get outside. Being outside and doing things outside, and this isn't necessarily a plug for that, but it is one of the easiest ways to get into flow. And it's one of the places where we notice it more. So we'll talk more about what that means later. But what I found was throughout my life, I've been into outdoor adventure. And like you all, I found that I got into this flow more often: rock climbing, mountain biking, mountaineering. And we started thinking, well, we're an outdoor company, we're taking leaders outside. One thing that we always see is getting into flow. We should probably research this. So I started reading about it. And the first article I found was a McKinsey report. And McKinsey had found over a 10-year longitudinal study, so they studied executives all over the place over 10 years, that executives are 5 times more effective when they're in flow. So I was expecting like some flowery stuff, maybe some like yoga websites about flow. And here's McKinsey, a high-end consulting firm, saying like this makes executives 5 times more effective. And that kind of blew me away. And then you start digging more, and DARPA found that sharpshooters become experts in half the required time if they're in flow. So people at very hard-nosed places are finding that flow benefits us a lot. It helps us to learn a lot faster. It increases our creativity. It connects teams more quickly, and it just makes us more effective. I mean, if we could get all of our work done on Monday for the entire week, seems like a no-brainer. So it's pretty exciting to research that. But I think we think of flow as this kind of life hack. Well, if I could get more flow, I'd get more stuff done, I'd be more effective. And that's maybe true, but when we start looking at the history of flow, I picked up this book, highly recommend it. It's like a metaphysical, scientific exploration of flow and life in general. And then the first like 3 pages, I came across this quote. And basically, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is saying, if we don't take control of our lives, if we're not intentional about how we live, biology, social forces, other people, everything else is going to take over our lives, and we're not going to have any say in what happens. And we're not even going to be aware of that happening. And so I think this is a cool quote because it kind of cued me into, this isn't just about a productivity hack. This is about having a better life. Abraham Maslow, he studied motivation. We know him from the needs pyramid and that self-actualization, like 1% of the population is self-actualized. Talked a lot about peak experiences, and that's in a sense what flow is. It's this peak experience, this maximum happiness, maximum effectiveness. But it's also this way of life, and it doesn't have to be peak experiences. It could just be optimal performance. And it could be, we're finding more and more that they're micro flow sessions where you kind of get into little bits of flow here and there. It's not like an all or nothing. You're either one with the universe and time is completely gone, or you're not in flow. You can get into these micro flows. So it's not just about peak experiences.
Hey, Knight, what was that book that you held up? What was the title of it and the author?
Finding Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It's spelled just like it sounds.
Impressed that you can
yeah. You just have to say it confidently and hope for the best. I don't know. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. We're going to talk a lot more about that guy because he's pretty fascinating. But one thing that Stephen Kotler, another man I'm going to fill you in about, noted is that flow isn't necessarily about that peak experience. It's not about attaining a goal or performing perfectly. It's this autotelic experience. And what I mean by autotelic is it's a fancy word for being worth doing in and of itself. And so an example he gives is creatives, painters, artists, they don't create one masterpiece and then just keep it for the rest of their lives because that was what it was all about. It's about creating. They create a beautiful painting, move it out the door and start painting again, because that's where the flow is, just that process of creating. So to go through a little bit of the history, and this history, we talk about Nietzsche and all kinds of philosophers. This is a very surface level skim of the history of flow. And you can, I think, go back all the way to eudaimonia and Greek philosophy and see strains of flow throughout it. But this is kind of where we are today. So Albert Heimswil, Swiss geologist, he's on a mountaineering expedition and he falls. And he writes about this experience of time slowing down. He felt like he was one with the universe. He's literally looking at all of his expedition mates and thinking like, I wonder what they're going to do if I die, and thinking about whether or not he's going to be injured so badly that he's not able to do his presentation for the college that's coming up in a week. And all of this happens in like 3 seconds because he's in this kind of metaphysical state. We would think a flow state, this near-death experience. He doesn't die, and he's blown away by this experience. Like, how could that have happened? How could I have thought all those things in just those couple seconds? So he does all these interviews, 32 interviews with other near-death experiences, and finds similar experiences. William James takes that and starts running with it and starts thinking, well, what is this mystic experience? And I've just learned this recently, like mystic just means out-of-body experience. It doesn't mean magic or anything like that. So people who meditate and can get that oneness with the universe, a lot of that is around flow as well, get a mystic experience. And so William James found like near death was a common denominator across all these experiences. He found that you have to have some sort of a risk. So if you want to look smart in a dinner party or something like that, you can just reference the Yerkes-Dodson curve. Just be like, oh yeah, the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And everybody will smile and nod because they don't know what you're talking about. But basically it says that the more stress you have to a point, the better your performance. And we know this. If you have no stress, you're not going to perform well. You're going to be bored. If you have way too much stress, you're going to be anxious, terrified, shut down in that flight or fight mode. But it's somewhere in the middle is your optimal performance. So he started linking optimal performance and peak experiences to stress. This guy, pretty interesting if you start looking him up. Was a World War I physician, and kind of came up with a lot of what we know about the human body. Back then, you weren't like specialized into endocrinology as a doctor. He was looking at everything and figuring things out. And he found the flight or fight response. It's pretty common knowledge now. When you get scared, your amygdala hijacks you. You get that flight or fight, and your body is either going to fly or fight, whatever the threat is, whatever you're scared of. We didn't know that was the case back then. And what's important about this is that our reaction to fear isn't just an emotion. Our bodies change. So he's figuring out what we've now pulled a lot of the science out of in flow, that our bodies are changing when we're in flow. Maslow, which talked about a little bit already, but he looked at the peak experiences and then self-actualization. And one thing he found was that self-actualized people have more peak experiences and actively seek more peak experiences. So I think an interesting point here is if you are or want to become self-actualized, you should be trying to find more peak experiences. You should be seeking out flow. Finally, down to Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. This guy figured all of this out. He was 7 when World War II started. He went to a concentration camp in Italy, and he started seeing that across the board, same conditions, everybody's possessions, everything's been taken away. Some people are able to be happy, and some people are not. And he, as a kid, is watching, why are some of these adults coping with this well, and some just completely crumbling? And then as he went into a psychology career, he found that 30% of people on average say that they're happy, and that number has stayed the same over the last 100 years. But our average income has gone up dramatically. Let me go back here. Has gone up dramatically. So it's not really about money. It's not like a equation of if you get more money and your needs are taken care of, you're going to be more happy. And he started thinking, well, if some people in really terrible circumstances are able to be happy, and some people in relatively really good circumstances can't be happy, what is this happiness thing? And so he went into his research trying to figure out what's the key to happiness. How do we create more of the people who are resilient and able to be happy in a concentration camp? And what he ended up doing was what he calls experience sampling method. Back then, they were pagers. He would give a bunch of research subjects a pager, page them at random times throughout the day and say, what are you doing and how do you feel about it? And he started to find this, like sometimes people are really happy and really effective. And it's not like they're not sitting on a couch watching TV, I'm happy. It's like I'm at work and I'm super engaged, I'm very happy. And he started pulling that string. He did about 800 interviews, and many of those people talked about, well, it felt like I was just flowing down a river or going with the flow was around me. Everybody's mentioning this word flow. So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi coined the term flow for this maximum happiness, maximum effectiveness state. Just to go into happiness a little bit is, the definition, if you look it up, is a state of being happy. Great. That's super useful if you're trying to live a good life. If you dig a little bit more, you find that a concept of eudaimonia, a life well lived, or human flourishing. But Stephen Kotler talks about happiness in 3 domains or 3 levels. So first, there's the hedonistic. Just like you have a really nice IPA, you're sitting on a couch, you're happy in that moment, but maybe your life isn't fulfilling and you're not human flourishing. Then there's flow. When you're in flow, you are happy by definition. Like the cocktail of hormones in your brain makes you happy. And then at the apex of happiness, the best possible state of happiness is when you can combine flow states with purpose or meaning. So if you can find a way, I'd like to think that maybe I've done this, but we'll see. In terms of my business, like I love being outside. I'm in flow all the time outside. And there's a lot of meaning and purpose behind it. If you can find a way to do that for yourself, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be outdoor adventures. People get into flow coding computers, doing video games, writing books, writing blogs, all kinds of ways to get into flow. If you can couple that with purpose and meaning, you're going to have a better life. Stephen Kotler, has anyone read any of Stephen Kotler's work? Pretty fun to read his work. He's a little more popularist. He was an author, a journalist. He's an entrepreneur. He's one of the preeminent researchers on flow now. He started out at the Flow Genome Project, and that's now moved into the Flow Research Collective. There's a great podcast out. You can look up the Flow Research Collective for that. But he's written The Rise of Superman, Stealing Fire, and I just finished The Art of the Impossible. All 3 of those books talk about different aspects of flow. If you only read one, The Rise of Superman is fantastic. The Art of the Impossible kind of sums everything up. And he even says, one of the last chapters I just finished, I've made some updates to what I wrote in Rise of Superman. That's the way scientists deal with it, which I thought was kind of funny how he put it. But what he's done is he's taken fMRI and blood tests and been able to look at action athletes like Laird Hamilton, Shane McConkey, like people doing crazy things outdoors, and figure out what's going on inside the body, inside the brain while that's happening. And he's taken the flow triggers, which we'll talk about later, from like 6 that Mihai had figured out from ESM to 22 now. And the point he makes is we've been looking at this focus for maybe 30 years. So yeah, we have 22, there are probably 200. We just don't know them yet, which is pretty cool to think about how this is kind of cutting edge in terms of human performance. So what is flow? Lots of words, lots of sciencey stuff. I'm sitting there teaching flow at New River Gorge with a group. We're climbing, and someone's like, "Knight, like, yes, I hear all the things you're saying, but what is flow?" And I was like, "Look, it's when you're happiest and most effective. Period. That is a flow state." You can pull different definitions: state of optimal experience arising from intense involvement and activity that's enjoyable. There are different markers for flow and different preconditions that we're going to talk through. The big markers are that sense of timelessness, time slips away, a sense of selflessness, you lose your ego, you're just completely absorbed in that task, and sometimes a loss of self, so that oneness with the universe. To be clear and fully transparent, I haven't figured that one out yet, but it's cool and I look forward to trying. So what happens in flow? What we know now, a couple of key points is flow is ubiquitous. It's not like a super athlete phenomenon. Everyone has the capability to get into flow if certain preconditions are met. And it's not a light switch. It's not an on-off thing. You have to go through this flow cycle. And we're talking in depth about what each of these phases are. And I mentioned earlier, like when I was climbing in Joshua Tree, I was in that struggle phase. And I was able to trip myself into flow by thinking like, maybe I'm in struggle. Maybe I could just release and go into flow. But the key point is you have to go through struggle phase to some extent to get into flow. It's not like you stack all the triggers and you drop into flow accidentally. So just to frame what I'm talking about here, this is a graph of brain waves, kind of interesting stuff. Beta brain waves are what we find if you're stressed out, you're trying to solve a problem. A lot of day-to-day life we spend in beta. It's a little higher frequency, lower amplitude. You get into alpha if you're meditating, you're a very peaceful state. You get into theta if you're really much deeper in your meditation or falling asleep. And then delta is like a deep sleep. And you can measure these. You can see what people's brain waves are, which is pretty cool because then you can measure people in flow and see where they are. The gamma is actually super cool. You can't access gamma waves unless you're in theta, and flow coincidentally puts you right between alpha and theta. So you're right on the verge of gamma. And gamma happens when you take disparate ideas and put them together to form new knowledge. So it's creativity, it's novel, useful ideas, and it happens as your neurons link, which is pretty cool. Like your brain is changing physically when you see these gamma waves. And then there are hormones, all the things that are going on in our brains and our blood. Cortisol, most of us know, is the stress hormone. It's really good for flight or fight. Not so good for chronic stress syndrome, where you're just constantly loaded up with cortisol. It hurts your heart. You want to get that cleared out if you're not actively flying or fighting. Epinephrine is adrenaline. Norepinephrine is adrenaline that's kind of triggered for the brain, so it helps you focus more. Anandamide's name comes from bliss. Ananda is bliss in ancient Greek, and it also binds with THC receptors in our brain. So it's kind of the same thing. If you were to get high on marijuana, you get anandamide. It gives us this really happy feeling. Dopamine, this is funny, like all of this is around drugs. To be clear, it's better to get into flow mountain biking than on cocaine and methamphetamines. Dopamine is like doing cocaine. Is our brain's way of rewarding us. When we get something right, when we pass a test, when we get a piece of candy or whatever it is that we like, our brain spikes up dopamine and gives us that little boost of reward. Endorphins are a natural painkiller. So you see that in runner's high a lot. People run for a long time, they get a lot of endorphins, they feel really happy, they don't feel a lot of pain. That's our body's natural way of making it so that we can run longer. And serotonin is just a happiness What we do is for people who deal with depression, you use serotonin uptake inhibitors. If you take medication for that, it's making it so that the brain can't redissolve serotonin, so it makes you happier. On the flip side, I lived in Washington State for a while. I love it because I love to ski, but if you're up there for too long, there's not enough light. In the winter, you get this seasonal affective disorder. That's just a low level of serotonin. So the more serotonin you have, the happier you typically are. These are just some of the chemicals that go on through the flow cycle. So going into the cycle, you got to start with struggle, unfortunately, and that's going to be that beta. It's going to be stressful, the beta brainwaves, problem solving. You're not really sure what to do. It may be mountain biking on something that's a little harder than you're used to. It might be an interpersonal conflict, trying to give a team member hard feedback. It just feels really frustrating and uncomfortable. A key point here is you have to have the knowledge to get into flow. So if you've never been on a bike before, you're not going to get on a mountain bike and just drop into flow. Like, oh, I'm struggling. Great, I'm in flow. You have to know kind of how to mountain bike, the mechanics of it. You have to know how to give good feedback. You have to know whatever it is. So the more you can learn about something, the more likely you are to get into flow. Whether it's an outdoor action sport or leading people or whatever your trade is, the more you learn about it, the more likely flow is. When you release, you know enough that you can automate the process. So your body can move away from thinking about mountain biking or whatever it is and just let it happen. And that opens up this whole world of opportunity and creates flow for it. So norepinephrine goes up. You're disassociated from the thing. Often if you're like really trying to figure out this hard problem at work, if you just take an hour off, go take a shower, go for a walk, go for a run, mountain bike, whatever, you have those ideas like, oh, that's what I should do. That's what's happening here. You're moving away from the problem, you release, and then you get this little burst of flow. Flow, we already talked about alpha and theta waves. You're in this kind of almost meditative state. But what's cool about flow is you're actually using way less of your brain. One myth that's been out there for a long time is we only use 10% of our brains. And so like really effective people can use more of their brain. It's not actually true. And when you're hyper effective, like you are in flow, your brain is shutting down a lot of your prefrontal cortex. So it's called transient hypofrontality, and it's making everything automatic and it's totally 100% focused on the task at hand. So it doesn't have time to think about problem solve, use the prefrontal cortex. It's just do the thing, like surf the wave, go down the hill, have the conversation, whatever it is. You get a ton of dopamine. You get that natural painkiller endorphins. You get norepinephrine, which brings in your focus. You get anandamide, so you're super happy. And you can start to see why flow is such a wonderful experience, why people remember it since they were in 10th grade working on JL subwoofers, because you have all these really great hormones in your brain saying like, this is good, keep doing this. But it can't last forever. People actually can die from being in flow for too long. It happens in computer gaming. Like people are in that flow state, they're totally engaged. They forget to eat, sleep, and do all the things that they need to do to live. And so flow takes a lot of work. And to get into flow more often and more effectively, you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to get good sleep. You've got to eat well. You've got to learn and study and get that knowledge in that frustrating struggle phase so that you can have the tools to get into flow. So recovery doesn't mean having a cold beer on the couch. It means taking care of yourself, getting enough sleep, meditating, stretching, all of those things that we all know we should do. And we don't do until we get to like 35 and older and realize that we actually have to do them. Any questions so far? I'm going to start going into triggers and preconditions and how we can get this more in our lives, but I want to just check in with you all, see if you have any questions about flow or things on your mind.
Hey, Knight, when you said that you were, climbing a Joshua tree and you were struggling, and then you just kind of told yourself, hey, I need to release. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, is that just kind of a mindset of just like, hey, I need to let go and just let it happen, or like, what does that look like?
To be clear, don't just let go.
Don't let go of the rock.
Yeah, it's that flow cycle. So in the struggle, you're frustrated, you're stressed out, you have all the cortisol. And I was literally saying like, well, the next stage in that cycle is release, which then leads to flow. So like, this is where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be struggling. And I think that cognitive like oh yeah, the next step is this, just push me over the edge into that release and then flow portion of the cycle.
So just the knowledge of that, just knowing that
yeah,
it's going to happen.
Which is what gave me a lot of hope that like, hey, if we stack these triggers and think about this intentionally, maybe we can do it more often. Right? I think
Nice.
That's what like Stephen Kotler and Flow Research Collective and a lot of these people are finding and doing, which is pretty cool. Any other questions? Cool. How do we do this more often? This is a great graphic that one of our clients created after we talked about flow for a weekend while we're canoeing on the Colorado River. There's a lot to it. Like I said, there are 22 triggers. I'm going to share some of the most common, most important ones. And I recommend like write them down. If you're interested in this, none of these are bad things. If you did all of these and never got into flow, your life would be better. So it's worth thinking about, well, how do I do these things more often in my life? And then notionally, you'll start getting into flow more often. I'll talk a little bit more about other ways as well. Clear goals. These are straight from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. People in flow have clear goals. That's really important to think about personally and as a leader if you're leading a team or an organization. So goals are fascinating. In like the 50s and 60s, we thought goals were bad. Like if you gave people specific goals, they would crumble under the pressure and not do as well. And we should just say like, hey, do your best. And these guys, Locke and Latham, are kind of the famous, the godfathers of goal setting theory, which is now one of the few motivation theories that all of management academia agrees upon. Found that no, actually, if you give a specific and difficult goal that the person agrees about, like you can't just say, I want you to do this. And they're like, well, I hate doing mountain biking night. Like, that's great that you have that goal for me. They have to want to do it. But if it's specific and difficult and agreed upon, they're much more likely to accomplish it and be more motivated. So having goals for yourself, for your team, really important for lots of different reasons, but it's a clear precondition for getting into flow. If your goal isn't to go faster on your mountain bike or to make your team function better at work or to do whatever it is that you do better, you're going to have a hard time getting into flow. This one's cool. Immediate feedback. Like if you're mountain biking, you got immediate feedback. Like if you lean the wrong way, you start going off the trail. Rock climbing, same thing. That's one of the reasons I think action sports are so lend themselves to flow so well. But think about teams. Like we're talking about performance management for one of our company hikes coming up this month. And a lot of companies do yearly performance appraisal. That's crazy. Like you are not going to get into flow if you're talking about feedback every year. A lot of companies are moving to weekly. Stephen Kotler would say even do it daily. Like you should have like a daily feedback session to hear how you're doing, because that's going to help you get into flow a little bit better. Limit your distractions. Like all of us have gotten into the zone, and then if you have kids, they like run into the room and grab you and you're like, whoa, oh no, like I've lost my flow, right? Or coworkers, there's the zeitgeist of having open floor spaces in offices. That's the cool thing to do. That will not create flow for individuals. If people are walking by and saying hi to you all the time, you're not going to have flow. You might have more creativity. You might have more collaboration. You have to balance like how you want to structure your culture. But I would say have places where people can go get away from distractions and then have that open space where you can create more creativity and collaboration. The other cool thing here is if you think about your energy, like scientists show we have about 3 to 5 hours of like high energy, high performance. And I'm curious from you all if you think differently, but after that, we're just kind of mediocre, you know, like maybe you're a 7 a.m. to noon or a 9 a.m. to 2, but whatever it is, you have that peak energy zone, and then you have mediocre, and you probably have another 2 hours in the day. For me, it's like 2 to 4 p.m. where you're just dog tired. Like you're not going to get really good stuff done. If you can figure out what that time is and do the rest of this, limit your distractions, get great feedback, have a clear goal, you're much more likely to get into flow. So thinking about like, when am I energized? When are my peak moments of the day? Maybe it's morning and evening, maybe it's just once a day. How do I stack the triggers for that time?
Yeah. And hey, Knight, I hate to disagree with you. This is your presentation, but
No,
I would argue that some people like Stu actually live in mediocre. Just a sidebar.
well, it's all relative, Like some people will just have higher peaks than others. That's a good point.
Especially after 8 p.m. Done.
Yeah, my peak moment is from 7 to 7:01. From there, it's all mediocre.
That's right.
Hey man, that's a good 12 hours and 1 minute. It's because you're exceptional.
Nice. I like this one, rich environment. Flow is all about 100% absorption in what you're doing. So if you're in an environment that you're in all the time, nothing is novel, nothing's new to you, you're not going to be paying attention, really. It's like driving to work. You're just kind of like going through the motions. You probably don't even realize what you're doing. If you can create some uncertainty, unpredictability, novelty in your environment, it'll help you get into flow because you're going to be more focused on what's going on around you, just biologically. Ways to do that? I mean, go for a walk, go outside, take your strategy meeting outside. Probably a lot of you have done this, but if you're trying to write a blog or an article or something important, if you go to a coffee shop, somehow it miraculously happens faster. That's because you're in a unique environment. You've just changed that a little bit to help you pay attention more. I love this one. It's the 4% challenge. This is not hard math, but it means that the challenge, whatever you're trying to get into, mountain biking, leading, whatever your work is, needs to be a little bit more than what you think your skills are, your perceived skills. So the perceived challenge is about 4% harder than you think you can do. And my hypothesis is that this is why DARPA found that our learning is cut in half. The time it takes to become an expert is cut in half when we're in flow, because you're always learning if you're in this zone. If you're always trying to figure things out, your brain's just always engaged. If you're not, if the challenge doesn't match your skill, it's like something that's easy for you, you get bored. We've all been there. If it's way too hard, you get stressed out, overwhelmed, and your performance goes down. We're back to the Yerkes-Dodson, where everybody can smile and nod, like, oh yes, Yerkes-Dodson, of course. But people always ask, like, well, what is 4% challenge? Well, it's pretty freaking hard. It shouldn't feel easy at all. And the example I give is a fever. If you go 4% higher on your body temperature, you have a fever, 98 to 102. So think about, like, how do I make this hard but still engaging? Like, there's a potential that I can succeed, but there's also a potential I wouldn't succeed. If you feel super stressed, back it off a little bit. You start to feel bored, go back up. This is called the flow channel. This is something that Mihai talked about a lot. And what's cool about it is you don't have to become an expert mountain biker to get into flow mountain biking. You need to find trails that will challenge you at 4%. So when you're just starting out, you're just learning how to pedal, you're just on a double track dirt road and you're going to be at 4%. Maybe you can attain flow. As you gain more, you learn faster, you learn more, you do single track, you start doing crazier things, you still stay in that flow state. This is another book recommendation for you all. Dr. Mishi Jha wrote Peak Mind. Fascinating. It's all about attention. And she doesn't talk about flow at all, but I think that her research really complements flow, because she's talking about how do you pay full attention to a thing. And Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Stephen Kotler, Flow Research Collective, they're all talking about, like, flow is undivided attention. Cool things about undivided attention, the timelessness that comes from that. When you're so totally engrossed in something, your brain shuts down the parts of it, like especially in the prefrontal cortex, that hypofrontality, that keep track of time. So you lose track of time. Even cooler to me, like, our brain has a little piece in it that helps us distinguish us from the rest of the world. And if you think about, like, on an atomic level, it's pretty gray zone, like where my skin cells start and the rest of the world stops. It's not actually that cut and dry. There's a pretty large gray zone there on an atomic level. So our brain needs to be able to distinguish, like, where am I? Where's the rest of the world? That part shuts down when you're, like, really deep in flow. And that's where you get that, I felt like I was one with the world. That's where if you're really into meditating, you can get into that oneness. It's that part of your brain shutting down because you're so focused. And the reason that it focuses, the reason it shuts down other things, is because it takes a lot of energy. Anyone who's tried even today to focus on a task, you get drained. It takes a lot of energy. So your brain shuts down all the parts of the brain that it doesn't need to focus completely on the thing. Okay, so this is a question. I'm curious if you all have thoughts or answers now, but how can you stack some of these things? Like get clear goals, immediate feedback, get into a novel, rich environment, have that 4% challenge. Like, are there examples or ways that you all can think of now that you want to share with the group or write down that you can start stacking these triggers? Because the more that you stack them, the more likely you are to find yourself in flow.
I think just pushing yourself to get outside and go do hard things. I mean, I feel like, just you've been using mountain biking a lot, but like challenge yourself to go do a harder track, right? Or go do something scary, go climb a mountain. Yeah, I think just pushing yourself to do harder things than what you think you can do regularly.
Yeah, and there's this Thursday we're going, and there's a couple guys on the call that are going to join us to go snowboarding. But you even think about, every time you go snowboarding, there's always this opportunity that there's maybe a lip that you're looking off and like, okay, do I want to try that? There's maybe a jump that you're looking at. There's these different scenarios that every time I go, that it's an experience. But I think now intentionally putting yourself in the frame of mind of, okay, I'm going to try this because I want a 4%, right? I want to do this thing. And then the reward of that, when you land it, when you hit that single track, you're going down, you've never done it that fast before, whatever, that those hits that you get after that are pretty significant, and you're better for it. So I think this Thursday, shameless plug for dudes going to the mountains, but hey, find your 4%, which for Stu is like school marm. It's a 4%.
No, nobody knows what school marm is.
School marm, a very, very 3-mile long green run for kids. That's what school marm is.
David, did you ever get into flow just stew bashing? You just like, I'm in the flow
every
right
day,
now.
Dude. It is like, and it get there quick, right?
Yeah.
The only problem is it's not novel. It's not. I have to go to different environments maybe to do it.
Nice. I love that you all point that out. This is a quote from Stephen Kotler: "The more flow you have, the more flow you have." And so it's a plug from me to get outside, because it's easier to get into flow. Trail running, mountain biking, climbing, snowboarding, skiing. It's all over the literature about flow. Like we talk about skiing a lot. Skiers, good skiers, that is flow. But when you start thinking about it, like I started with that story in the beginning, you start to realize, well, this is what it feels like. Could I do it at work? Could I do it in conversations? Could I do it in any domain of my life where I want to be a little more engaged, happy, and effective? So the more flow you have, the more flow you have, the more you go outdoors, the more you can practice that, but you don't have to. Like I said, you can do it coding or playing games or writing articles or anything that requires attention. You can start honing that skill of stacking the preconditions for flow and getting into flow, and then recognizing like, oh, yeah, I'm kind of in a little bit of flow. Like maybe I should shut the door to limit the distractions and these kinds of things. One point that Kotler makes in one of his books is likely the most common occurrence of flow in the world is when two managers come together for a quick meeting to solve some kind of problem. And then 3 hours later, like, oh my gosh, like I haven't used the bathroom and we just missed lunch, because you get into that flow of trying to solve the problem together. It happens to me all the time. Like you have a meeting, it's about something important that you care about and you're trying to solve a problem. You can drop into that flow really easily. You just have to recognize it and say, oh, that's what that was. That creates the opportunity to have more of it.
I've never had flow in a meeting with David. I'll just say that right now.
You two crack me up.
But it's probably because he's not really contributing anything of use. So it's very difficult to achieve flow if you're simply receiving.
Nice.
But I don't know. I leave it to you. I leave that to you, Knight.
Yeah. I'll send you all a diagnostic later.
Yeah.
I think it's important to think about these triggers, and you're going to forget them all in 10 minutes after this. Like that's human nature. So if you're interested, look them up, write them down, put them on a sticky somewhere where you see them often, and start structuring your day. Like you can limit your distractions. You can group all of your more strategic, thought heavy work into that time where you have more energy. You can ask for feedback. Like Dave has given Stu a lot of feedback today. You can ask for that feedback from someone you trust. Like, how am I doing on writing this article, or how am I doing on leading? So you get that more immediate feedback than a yearly performance appraisal. And then this gives me hope that when you have struggles, if you've done the homework, if you've learned and studied the thing, it could be that you're just getting close to flow. And you can even, like I did, decide. And that doesn't happen all the time. Like, it's not oh, if you're struggling, just decide to be in flow and everything will be perfect. Like, that's unfortunately not how it works. But when you're in struggle, when you're frustrated, when you feel like it's impossible, you might just need to push a little bit harder to get into flow. Stephen Kotler talks about these 5 different motivators and how they kind of layer. So curiosity leads to passion, leads to purpose, and then there are more down the road. But that curiosity to passion step, you watch the Power Rangers, you're like, I'm going to be a ninja, like that looks so cool. And then you go to karate and you're like, this is hard. Like, this is hard work. I thought I was just going to go to karate classes and be able to do like crazy cool kicks and backflips. You have to have grit in between those 2 steps. Whatever it is that you're interested in developing in your life, if you don't have grit to go through that struggle phase, you're not going to be able to get to passion and purpose and then be able to build a lifestyle of flow around it. So the best way to start with grit, this is from Kotler again, is physical. Like, it's just easy to push yourself physically. Go snowboarding, try the extra jump, do a harder workout, whatever it is. You start developing that muscle of grit, and then you can go into mental and moral, which is a lot harder. Like, to focus on reading an academic article about something you're interested in, to me, is a lot harder than lifting a little bit longer on your workout. So think about, how do you build more grit? Flow plus meaning, ultimate happiness. I don't know. That's Stephen Kotler's hypothesis. It's probably not too far off, and certainly worth thinking about. Like, how do I create more flow around something that has meaning to me, that gives me purpose? You're probably going to have more happiness through that process. If you're interested, you're fascinated in this, like, shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you a list of books, some articles, things like that. I think it's pretty fascinating. It's complex, and it spans, what I think is cool about flow is it spans that philosophy, psychology, neurology, biochemistry, physiology, and action adventure sports. Like, how cool is that? You can just throw some big wave surfing in for fun. Just to plug for us, we have, for the rest of the day, we've kind of extended our Black Friday sale for a while, but these 4 adventures are 50% off. So take a look if you're interested. We do weekend-long adventures where we talk about concepts like this: communication, flow, decision-making, character and authenticity. We talk about the science behind them, then we practice them real time on an outdoor adventure. So check those out. And then I'm open to whatever questions, comments, or just frivolous poking of fun that David might have.
Hey, I've heard a lot of guys on podcasts that talk about this idea of doing a misogi, like choosing something like really, really hard, to where like there's probably half of a chance that you're not going to be able to succeed in that. Have you done anything like that? Do you do that? I mean, does that help get into flow state at all? Like, just going so hard on things?
Great question. I think it refines you spiritually. I've done plenty of misogis on accident. Like, I thought it was going to be a lot easier to climb the mountain, and then I'm there for 30 hours straight or whatever. I haven't purposely done a misogi. So where I'm familiar with misogi from is The Comfort Crisis, which is a fantastic book about why we should be less comfortable and what we're losing by being too comfortable. And the misogi is a goal that you're 50% likely to fail on. So by definition, it's going to be hard to get into flow on a misogi if your like challenge skill level is 50% removed. It might be a little different. You might have like micro spots. Like if I'm climbing something that's really hard, like when the climbing comes down to my level, I could get into flow, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a pathway to flow. But it is a cool and humbling thing to think about, well, what can I do that would be really hard for me, no matter how much I train for it? Like, it's just so risky or unpredictable or difficult that I'm only have a 50% shot at succeeding. So it might be like a rim to rim to rim in the Grand Canyon, or traveling, all around the world, manpower, or whatever, like whatever you come up with. It doesn't have to be like a year-long thing, but pretty cool concept. What else?
Hey, Knight, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
Great stuff. My question is around most of what I've thought about in flow and what you've shared is kind of individual. It's sort of internal to you. But right at the end there, you mentioned something about meetings and teams and with others. So what's out there for flow beyond one person, like flow in a group or flow in a team?
Yeah, that's kind of the cutting edge of research on flow, although like all of flow is kind of cutting edge, which is cool. There's group flow and there's team flow. So group flow is kind of when everybody's in flow in sync, and team flow is group flow that's facilitated by good team dynamics. And if you think about some of those triggers, like they all work on an individual level. That's what we've been talking about. But having clear goals, like that is by definition what you need to have a high performing team. Like you got to have a shared vision. Immediate feedback, like hopefully good leadership is going to be setting clear expectations and giving feedback often enough that people feel like they can meet that expectation. So there's research around like what is team flow. If you reach out, I can send you an article that's pretty fascinating about it. And some of the questions are like, does everyone have to be in individual flow to have team flow, or is this a totally separate thing? You read about improv troops that are operating at a very high level. Jazz musicians have common occurrences of team flow. Special operators in the military often have what we think is team flow. The point that Kotler makes about it is really hard to study. Like it is hard to put a bunch of fMRI helmets on jazz musicians and be like, all right, we want you to get it in flow now so we can study what's going on. So that's part of why it's cutting edge. We just don't have the tech to study it scientifically, but it definitely is happening. So great question.
Now, I was curious, how does you hear about it in like the Blue Angels. I personally went through it with a session having to do with driving race cars in terms of the power of visualization, at ground speed 0, and how that connects to success afterwards. I was curious, is there any research as to like how the bridge between the act of visualization in the same way that a Blue Angel would before their show, and then like being in flow in a defined period of time afterwards?
Yeah, great question. There's a ton of research about how and why that works, and I'm not super savvy on it, so I won't try to act like I know all about it, but the research shows that it does work, right? Like athletes visualizing success, race car drivers, Blue Angels, like visualizing what it should look like helps you perform better. As long as you're visualizing correctly, like you have to have the skills to be able to visualize it. I don't know that it creates more flow, other than it probably accelerates that struggle phase, that frustrating trying to figure things out so that you can drop into flow type phase. So bottom line, like, yes, you should be doing that more and more often. It's an easy and useful way to build those neural networks, because that's what it does, is it builds the neural network that you need to then do the thing, which then can automate the thing, be it driving race cars or whatever else. What else? Any other questions? We're coming up on time here.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes if anybody has any last burning desire questions.
And I'm gonna miss the beginning of the chat, but is it easy to recognize when you're in flow? Like, is it a cognitive, like, hey, I'm in it, I'm gonna keep going?
Yeah, it's the more you're in flow, the harder it is to recognize because you lose the sense of self. So by definition, flow is like you've lost the sense of self. And so if you stop to think like, oh, I'm in flow right now, like you're popping yourself out of flow a little bit to have that thought. I think it's really easy to recognize when you were in it. It's that moment when you're like, oh, geez, it's dinner time. Like I totally lost track of time, but it is harder to observe yourself if you're in flow. And the more deeply you're in flow, the less likely you are to observe yourself.
Okay, cool. And then follow up to that. If it's easy for you to get into flow, is it really easy for you to stay there in a prolonged period, or do people like bounce in and out of it?
Yeah, you kind of have to, again, like if you're deep in flow, you're not eating or sleeping or doing the things that you need to do to stay alive. So you have to come out of it just to stay alive, to recover. It takes a ton of energy, both in your brain and your body, to be in flow. So yeah, you can't stay in there for like a long time. It's not like, oh, I'm going to get in flow for the next month. That's pretty unrealistic. It's more like 90 minutes, 4 hours a day, maybe 2 days type thing. And you're probably going to bounce in and out a little bit. Like I'm imagining a mountaineering expedition. I often feel like I'm in flow in mountaineering, but then you like stop and take a break and make a coffee or lunch or whatever. And like, you're kind of coming out and then going back in. I think that's a more realistic expectation for yourself. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Marine in the group here. How do you spell Muskogee?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Like, how do I look that up? Because I'm trying to find that term.
M-I-Sogi.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it's MISOGI, if I recall correctly.
All right. Nice.
But look up the comfort crisis. I love that the Marine in the group's like, oh yeah, 50% chance of failure. Like that's the one.
That's it.
I was married to a Marine I am married to a Marine. She went into the Navy, so I don't know. It's confusing. Once a Marine, always a Marine. My wife's a Marine. Boil it down there.
This is good stuff, man. David, do you have any more like funny things that you feel like you need to say?
No, I did, Knight. I did feel like you were kind of minimalizing when I get into flow, making fun of Stu. I thought you minimalized the effort and the creativity required. So I just want to.
It's a daily struggle.
That flow looks like many different things to many different people. But
this was so easy. So
yeah, this was really informative, and I think all the resources that you provided are incredible. I have a new reading list which is ever growing, and it's kind of a problem. But yeah. I do appreciate the fact that that a lot of this stuff is not, you hear about things like professional athletes getting in the zone and you can't miss a shot, and I relate this, I think that's another way of them saying flow, but it always seems so to use a word you said early, mystical, right? It seemed like, well, you have to be doing this physical feat at a very high level to professional status to achieve these types of things. But I think it's the science-backed and the practical ways that you can set yourself in positions to achieve it is really, really useful. And to go beyond the physical feats, right? To go beyond the physical aspects of it, but to a mental and to a meeting and to a level of applying it to your business. I think these are all just really insightful and has me very intrigued to dig into. It made me think of one thing that I'm going to do more like it within our business is write more. And I think about the times that I go to a coffee shop and I never connected those dots, but in the coffee shop, it's like, bam, and it's done. And it's almost effortless. And so just being intentional with things like that, right? To put yourself in positions for optimal success for whatever it is, I think was really, really insightful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Interesting point that Stephen Kotler makes is we associate flow with extreme athletes because most of the research is done around extreme athletes. The only reason that it's done around extreme athletes is they could not do what they do without being in flow. Like they would just die. Yeah. And so we research them, and then the rest of us are like, well, I guess I'm not surfing 100-foot waves. So flow is just like a lucky thing, but it really isn't. Like we have clear preconditions and triggers that we can leverage. So.
Yeah, I love that.
Good stuff, man. Well, we're just a little bit over. Knight, this is awesome, man. Really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for taking an hour of your day to talk on this stuff. I learned a ton, and I know we'll get this sent out to everyone who registered. We'll send a replay out. For everyone that joined us, I appreciate you also taking an hour to learn on this stuff. Hopefully it made you better. It definitely made me better. So reach out to Knight, and if you have a business, a company, if you want to do like a leadership retreat, again, reach out to Knight. He's got some really cool stuff going on in his business. So Knight, thanks, man.
Thanks for the opportunity, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Knight, we need to get more Colorado on that list, buddy.
Yeah.
More Colorado
Working
on that
it,
list.
working on it.
Yeah, and we're gonna come. We
Yeah.
are going to have you come speak to our mastermind group on one of our retreats. So just plan on it in the future. All right. I know you said no to the next one, but we're gonna get you on another one in the future.
Awesome. I look forward to it.
Yeah, for sure, man.
All right.
Have a great one.
Awesome. Hey,
Right.
Knight, do you mind sticking on for 1 sec?
Got it. I'm going to stop recording or try to. There we go.
Awesome.
Mm.